The Environmental Protection Agency unveiled new rules today to curb mercury emissions from the nation's power plants. The standards apply to roughly 600 coal or oil-fueled power facilities. They'll have to either reduce their emissions or shut down. The battle over the rules stretches back 2 decades. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson said today the new regulations of multiple pollutants would save lives and clean the air.
And this is a suite of air toxic standards. It is mercury, it is arsenic, it is cadmium, it is chromium, it is cyanide, it is hydrochloric acid, it is hydrofluoric acid. And because the pollution control technology that will go on these plants will also get some soot out of the air, it means by addressing some toxics, we're actually addressing a suite of toxics and getting a lot of health benefit.
But there's a reason the rules have taken so long to take effect. For more on that, we get 2 views. Scott Siegel is director of the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council, an energy industry trade group, and John Walk is Clean Air Director for the Natural Resources Defense Council. John Walk, how big is the problem which the EPA now says they're trying to solve?
This is the most significant clean air and public health achievement in a generation, and it is a huge problem with coal-burning power plants emitting more toxins into America's air than any other source of pollution. So cleaning them up is a huge success story to celebrate.
Scott Siegel, do you see it the same way?
Well, I don't. I will say that it is a very big, significant achievement on the part of the EPA in the sense that it represents the most expensive air rule potentially in EPA history. It represents the greatest intervention into the power marketplace and, for that matter, the job marketplace in a generation as well. I guess what I would say is that over the last 20 years, we've had about a 67% reduction in primary emissions coming from power plants, including mercury emissions and particulate matter emissions. Without this rule, what this rule adds is a substantial amount of cost frankly, at the expense of American job creation and the competitiveness of our manufacturing sector.
Let's talk about cost. The administrator said today $11 billion. That sounds expensive.
It's nearly $10 billion. The administrator also said that the health benefits to the American people would outweigh those costs by nearly 10 to 1, yielding benefits of up to $90 billion or more. What we have to recognize today is that the dirty power sector in America is imposing health costs on the American people of nearly $100 billion or more by not cleaning up their own pollution. And what this does is it makes the actors responsible for that pollution clean up. That's fair, that's reasonable. It will create jobs in the process from cleaning up those plants, and all of us will benefit.
Let's backtrack for a moment. When you say health costs, what do you mean?
Well, power plants are producing air pollution that causes neurotoxic damage to children and the unborn, heart attacks, strokes, asthma attacks. People are going to the hospital, they're missing work, they are going to the ER. And when we clean up power plants, we avoid those health costs to American families, to the economy. We get people back to work, and we have a healthier and more successful country.
Does those kinds of costs, do they outweigh the benefits, or do the benefits outweigh the costs, depending on how you define each?
Well, first things first, policies that maintain air quality in the United States are important, and they should be advanced. I agree with that. The problem is this rule does not do that. The incremental health care benefits associated with this rule, in our judgment, are virtually zero. And here's why. Most of the benefits, and by that I mean 99% of the benefits, do not come from mercury, but come from control of soot, sometimes called particulate matter. However, these are well-controlled emissions, and in fact the EPA is attempting to claim benefits when those same areas that it claims those benefits already attain standards that protect human health and the environment. So what the EPA is essentially doing is double counting the benefits that already arise under the Clean Air Act. That is unacceptable. In fact, there was recent material out from Professor Susan Dudley over at George Washington University, head of the Regulatory Studies program, that indicated incremental benefits, zero. In fact, costs so high that the increased cost of electricity and the increase in unemployment could result in greater threats to public health than this rule would purportedly address in the first instance.
I want to get back to those other costs,
Sure.
but I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that question, that they're double counting these health benefits.
Gwen, if that sounds overly complicated, it's because the truth is far simpler. When you clean up toxic air pollution from power plants using a handful of control equipment, you are simultaneously reducing the deadly pollution that causes heart attacks, strokes, asthma attacks, and other illnesses. We should celebrate that outcome. And what Lisa Jackson said today is this rule is delivering more health benefits to the American people, outweighing costs by about 10 to 1. And it's causing the polluters responsible for the problems to clean up their own pollution.
But are they paying more in other ways? Are they paying more for the electricity? Does their electricity become less reliable because there are going to be fewer plants?
Those are good questions. EPA estimates that any electric rate impacts would be, on average, about 3% to consumers. And in return, we're getting $100 billion in benefits to the economy and the health of the American people. EPA and the Department of Energy have said that there is not going to be an impact on electricity and keeping the lights on. In fact, these plants could lead to the retirement of less than 0.5% of all electricity producers in the United States. So that is not going to cause problems in meeting electric needs.
Well, that's one of the things I'm curious about, Scott Siegel, which is how many of these plants were going to close anyway? They're out of date, they were tired, and now need to be retired. So this would not have the kind of effect that perhaps some coal or energy producers would worry about.
Well, there's no doubt that some of these plants would retire over the natural course of things and under market conditions. The question we have to ask ourselves is, does it make sense to try and retire all of them simultaneously, and in so doing endanger about 8% of U.S. electricity? That's like taking 3 states offline. If a foreign power were to try and do that, we would regard it as a threat. So the bottom line is this. We do expect that there will be significant increases in electric power costs. In fact, in some areas of the country that are more heavily dependent on coal-fired power, we're looking at costs as high as a 20% increase.
Would it all, but would it all happen simultaneously?
No, of course not. The agency is providing many years to clean up these plants or decide whether the businesses want to.
4 years.
4 years with the opportunity for more time if plants decide that they find that they can't meet the standards. President Obama issued a very sensible and reasonable memorandum today laying out the steps that are available under the law. The agency is committed to doing that. The Energy Department knows that we can meet our electric needs. So, you're seeing a lot of fear-mongering from some quarters of the utility industry, not my friend Scott. And what you see are plants that have cleaned up already and know that we can and should. And some of the plants that haven't cleaned up are fighting this tooth and nail in Washington.
But your friend Scott said a few moments ago this is going to cost jobs.
It will cost jobs. In fact, one of the best economic analyses performed by a very reputable economic consulting firm indicated that we will lose about 1.44 million net jobs, meaning taking into account the job creation John referred to earlier with respect to air pollution compliance jobs.
So like retrofitting the plants would create jobs, but not for long.
For every one of those jobs, which exists on a temporary basis, because as soon as the retrofit is done, that job is over. For every one of those jobs created, 4 of those jobs in manufacturing sectors, mining, or in the power sector are likely to be lost. That's a trade-off we can ill afford. We've had so much debate, Gwen, about the payroll taxes and about giving $1,000 to middle-class families. It would be a shame to achieve that benefit of the tax holiday and in the same notion give back the $1,000 and increase utility bills to the middle class.
Your friend John is shaking his head.
Gwen, that notorious study just proves the adage that lobbyists can pay consultants to say anything in Washington. The truth is that when EPA and the Energy Department conducted the most exhaustive analysis of all the competing studies and information out there, they found that these rules are expected to produce construction jobs, good-paying construction jobs of 2 to 3 years for over 40,000 American workers, and permanent long-term jobs operating the cleanup equipment of over 10,000 jobs. So, these numbers that Scott's putting forward were paid for by industry, and they stand in stark contradiction with what EPA is saying.
Finally, it wasn't that long ago we were sitting probably at this table discussing the administration's rolling back of its plan to put tighter restrictions in place for smog regulations. And you weren't very happy about that at the time. No. You were not so unhappy about it. Is the administration being tougher than they need to be, or are they not being tough enough?
When the administration makes a wrong decision, we say so, but this is a historically right and successful achievement that should be celebrated. These standards are historic accomplishments that will produce a generational improvement in air quality, and they follow the science and the law, and all Americans will benefit from this.
Scott Siegel.
And as we see it, tremendous additional cost, both in the power bill and also in job creation in 20 different industrial sectors that are highly energy intensive and exist in an international marketplace. And all of that for virtually no incremental health benefits. It's a bad deal for America and at a very bad time to conduct such a deal.
Scott Siegel of the Electric Reliability Coordinating Council and John Walk of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you both very much.